Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're here to start our second panel, and I'm very pleased to introduce two of our panelists. John Diamond, to my immediate left, is the director of the Center for Public Finance at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. He's a macroeconomist whose interests include federal tax and expenditure policy, state and local public finance, and the construction and simulation of computable general equilibrium models. I got to find out what that means. John's the co-editor of Pathways to Fiscal Reform in the United States, Fundamental Tax Reform. These are both books, and has testified before all the committees of Congress, the House Budget Committee, the Senate Finance Committee, the Joint Economic Committee, and all the committees relating to tax and expenditure. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
And to my extreme left is Jay Kilgo, who's the superintendent of the district in Vidor. Thank you for coming out here, Jay, today. Jay is a career-long educator who started off as a teacher and then became a principal and has been the superintendent in Vidor with a community of about 4,200 students
Yes, sir.
for the past 12 years. And please thank both of our panelists for their long public service. Well, we've got a lot to talk about today. I'd first of all like for John to start off with an explanation of what the property tax measures on this November's ballot would mean for ordinary Texans.
So there are four components of what was passed in the special session. That included a homestead exemption, an increase in the homestead exemption of about 60,000 from 40 to 100,000. There was a compression in the tax rate worth about 10.7 cents. There's some change in the franchise tax, which makes it easier for small businesses to file or have the ability not to file, is probably the correct way to say it, which will make it easier for them to file their taxes. And then there's this 20% appraisal cap, which is a pilot program. They didn't call it an appraisal cap, but in essence, that is what it is. So overall, it's going to save taxpayers a significant sum of money. I think it was $18 billion. And so homeowners are going to see a reduction in their property taxes. School districts, the state is going to make up that money through some of the surplus money they had. So in theory, it is not going to affect the level of spending at the state level on education. It's just more of a moving the chips around the table. They're going to state finance more and collect less from local property taxes, mainly local M&O taxes at the school district level.
So, John, we're going to get back to school finance in a moment, but you're an expert on the efficiency or inefficiency of different forms of taxation and the incentives they generate. The state had a record $33 billion surplus. They chose to spend just over half of that, $18 billion, on this property tax relief. Was that, in your view, the most efficient way to spend down the surplus?
I definitely think property tax relief is an efficient way to spend it. How they chose to spend it on property tax relief, meaning homestead exemption versus compression, we could argue that. I think a compression would in general be both more efficient and would reach more people in terms of the exemption only gets homeowners. Renters are largely left out. And so there's some distributional issues there. But in terms of efficiency, property taxes are actually really inefficient. A lot of businesses get taxed on their inventories and structures. It's very easy for businesses to move in that they can shift where they hold stuff. And so it's not the most efficient forms of tax. As an economist, we see it as just a pure excise tax on capital. Capital's mobile. You usually don't want to tax things that are mobile because they move away from the tax.
Would economists then generally favor consumption and income taxes?
In general, yes, especially to fund something like this. And I think you see this in the school finance literature, that a lot of states have moved to not necessarily an income tax, but a flat business income tax, or some type of consumption tax, such as a value-added tax or a sales tax, or some other form of consumption tax.
So shifting over to you, Jay, I mean, it seems like the net amount of funding to your school district and districts like it is not really changing. It's more like the share of the taxes that comes from the state source versus from the taxpayers is shifting. So how do you view that as kind of the end user? Benefiting from this, reacting to this tax reform?
Yeah, there's been a criticism over the past years that the state wasn't, the local population was picking up an excessive portion of the school finance load. So shifting it more to the state is certainly a benefit. We are, so not to, I'm sure we'll get in the weeds a little bit about school finance. You've got the Robin Hood plan is what is commonly known of, where districts that exceed a certain wealth level have to send some of that money back to the state. We're not in that situation, but the state picking up more of a share will reduce the number of districts in that situation. So I think local populations will feel better knowing that their tax dollars are staying in their district. It is a wash. We're funded, a per pupil allotment is determined for each district, and that bucket is filled. Just a quick explanation is, for Vider, 4,200 students, the amount of money determined by the state is about $40 million to fund us year to year. So we fill that bucket with local taxes, and then when we don't meet, whatever threshold we don't meet is filled in by state. And so,
Through the basic allotment?
well, the basic allotment determines the amount. So, just general revenue from the state fills that in. The basic allotment, each student, $6,160. And so that tells us, hey, here's how much we're getting. And then the state fills it in through the state finance, the excess to meet that level. So we're just, to answer your question, we're even. Now, there is some concern that basic allotment needs to be more since it was set.
John, the House and the Senate were not in agreement for a long period of time. I think it took about 7 months before we got the tax deal that was finally enacted. My understanding of the differences is that the Senate version emphasized homestead tax relief more, and the House emphasized compression more. And there's also a movement, of course, across some, conservatives in Texas to try to eliminate the M and O school tax rate. Can you analyze these issues, starting by explaining what is the M&O rate?
So the M&O rate is the maintenance and operation rate for school districts. They would also have an INS rate, which is, you can think of one as just like your daily operations, and one is your investment in capital, or you would use it to fund debt and capital, debt financed capital specifically. So the difference between, and you nailed it, the difference between the Senate and the House version, the Senate wanted a much larger fraction of homestead exemption, and their concern was people that had fixed incomes, such as senior citizens, and they felt like the homestead exemption gave them a larger benefit or helped them out more. On the House side, the House wanted more compression. The House was concerned with small business owners and businesses in general, which did not or would not benefit through a homestead exemption. And so there was this tug of war between the Senate and the House all of the session. The final compromise is they kind of split between the homestead exemption and compression, and then they added in these two business provisions that were previously not in the agreement, and that would have been the changes to the franchise tax and this 20% appraisal cap for non-homestead properties, which is a bad policy. But that's not our issue today.
Well, what were the pros and cons of each approach, the House version and the Senate version? I always like to think about trade-offs.
Well, the pros of a homestead exemption is it helps homeowners, it helps senior citizens who are on fixed incomes and other people on fixed incomes. The pros of compression is that it does buy down the rate further. It is more neutral across many different types of taxpayers, so renters don't benefit at all from homestead exemption, but they would benefit from compression to the extent that when you compress the rate, supply and demand are going to determine the distribution of the reduction in taxes between landlords and renters. And so renters are pretty much left out of just a decrease in the homestead exemption, but they get some of the exemption if you compress rates. And then when you compress rates, that affects all taxpayers, whether you're a business taxpayer or a homeowner. And so that's a pro of that. If you want to spread that benefit across everyone paying taxes, both businesses and homeowners, then you want compression. If you really want to give the largest impact to people on fixed incomes, then you really want to favor an increase in the homestead exemption.
Although, of course, not all low-income Texans own their homes. Many are renters.
That's correct.
Yeah. This is a wonderful chance to introduce our third guest, Rod Bordelon, who is a distinguished senior fellow for regulatory affairs at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Rod is a lawyer and regulatory and legislative affairs consultant with over 30 decades I wish all of us could reach someday. With over 30 years of experience in insurance, workers' comp, and health law. And you've been appointed to boards and commissions by governors of Texas 11 times, reflecting your deep expertise on these economic policy areas. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Reflective of my experience, but also my age, obviously. But I appreciate it. And first of all, I want to be thankful for the rain that we're having. We desperately need it. We had a little more than I was anticipating this morning coming out of Austin, so I apologize for running a little late. I would just say, and I'm sorry I missed the very intro, but you know, the idea that what we're talking about here, about, you know, the way in which you parse out the tax implications of some of these reforms that the legislature just put in place are certainly important. The legislature and the governor's office have been deliberating on these for months before the session, frankly, years. The legislature has been attempting to compress property tax rates and provide some property tax relief. The important thing to remember this session is that this was an historic property tax reduction. It was, in fact, the largest property tax reduction in the history of the state of Texas. And for that, I think taxpayers and property owners in Texas should be thankful.
Now, Rod, we were talking about the use of the surplus. How sustainable are these cuts in the long term? I mean, $18 billion over 2 years, but what happens after that?
Well, it's an important point. This past session, the legislature and the state of Texas was very fortunate. We had a record surplus. I think we started the session with over $30 billion in surplus funds, which is the exact flipped opposite of the state of California, which has an excess of $30 billion deficit. One of the reasons, of course, is because Texas has a much better opportunity to balance its budget because we have a constitutional requirement that the legislature do so, and that constrains it. The state of Texas also imposes different requirements on constraining its own budget at the state level. And so to your point, even though we started this session with a record surplus, and we may not have that same level of surplus every session, what we have done at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is gone back and look at the trends over the last couple of decades. Really historically in that period of time, with some aberrations here and there, economic trends obviously can go up and down, such as the COVID year, 2020. But overall, we have had revenue growth, general revenue related revenue growth in Texas of around 9% annually. And the budgetary restrictions that the legislature imposes on itself on spending, they put a spending cap that is capped at the growth of population and inflation. So the population growth and inflation growth over that same time period has lagged that 9%. So the revenue has increased about 9% on average, and the population growth and inflation, which is where their spending caps, the budget cap, has been more like 5.5%. So you've got that gap in there of around 4% or in excess of 4%. And if you continue that trend, then that surplus could be applied toward things like property tax relief. If you think of what a surplus is essentially the state collected more revenue than it anticipated it was going to collect. It was collecting it from you, the taxpayer. It belongs to you, the taxpayer, and the state of Texas and the legislature and the governor are insistent on trying to return that in the most expeditious way possible. And so that's what they were doing this time. We did have the benefit, as I said, this session of having a greater than average revenue excess this time to start off with.
I will add to this point. I agree 100%. I do think there's two things to keep in mind. And the current surplus, there are two economic trends or actions. One, we just came out of COVID and the federal government just basically gave a lot of Christmas presents to all the states. So as that COVID money runs out, ARPA funds, that is a possible risk. The other thing is Texas collects a lot of revenue through a sales tax. If you look at consumption expenditures, they're out of line of their historic norm. And so I've been preaching in Houston that you need to be careful of setting your budget to current sales tax revenues, because as consumers also quit being given Christmas presents from the federal government and things tighten up, I expect that consumption as a share of GDP will return to its norm, which will reduce sales taxes. I think those are the two big risks as we look forward. Can we continue this level of spending? And I think our school superintendent would worry that if the state is going to fund a larger share and then the state runs into a tighter budget, obviously you don't want to get your funds cut, I'm assuming.
That was exactly what I was thinking. So it's a positive that our local taxes are bearing less of the responsibility, but there is fear in the future, will the funds remain there from the state? So yeah, that's a concern.
Now, Jay, the state, as John mentioned, the state relies on sales taxes for its share of public ed spending. What happens if there's an economic downturn? And in particular, where were you when the 2011 school budget cuts occurred? What was your experience of that, and are you fearful that could happen again?
The fear always exists. I was a principal at that time, and there were we did not go through a RIF. We did cut staff at that time, and it was somewhat traumatic in our school district, and there's memories of that, and there's always that fear lingers. So yeah, that's a concern. Inflation was brought up, so that basic allotment was set pre-inflation, and so we feel the pressure to increase salaries for teachers. It's still a competitive environment. We have a teacher shortage. The governor created a task force to try to increase the number of teachers in the pipeline. We're still hopeful that there will be some results to that, but when I talked about that year-to-year that year-to-year budget, and I used $40 million, that's a round number for our district, and I know that sounds like a lot, but each district is funded at a similar level based on their enrollment. The old rule of thumb was you need to be spending 75% of your budget, of your year-to-year budget on staff, on salaries. What I hear now, we're more in the 80% range in Vidor ISD, and I think more and more are inching toward that 85%. So, and there's a lot more to spend money on in a school district. And you've got supplies, you've got transportation, you've got maintenance, so utilities. So there's just a concern, will that level of funding hold out over time?
Why isn't the budget allotment indexed to the inflation rate?
What I've been told is it's not politically, it's not been well received in the past. And so there's a fear of, hey, when we do that, we're committing future funds. School administrators, we support that idea. That's something we would love to see. What I've been told is in the past, it's just a no-go with the legislature. But, when we're talking about what can we do, that would be, in a perfect world, we would like to see that basic allotment go up. We'd like to see it indexed to inflation, and then we wouldn't be coming back every 2 years asking for more money.
Now, Rod, your organization, what's your thought on the idea of indexing the allotment to inflation?
Well, again, I don't think it's something that you need to look at right now, given the growth of the valuations that are at play. Some of the problem that the legislature has had is trying to figure out how to constrain the growth of the revenue to all the local entities that rely on property taxes, stemming simply from the valuation growth. So a few years ago, the legislature put in place some revenue collection caps of 2.5% and 3.5%, whether it was a school district or a city or county. And so any revenue growth above that would have to go to the voters for approval. So believe in local control from that standpoint. If the local school board decides to go to the voters and ask for a revenue increase above that, they can do so. That ability is there. But short of that, it constrains that growth. So that's really what we've been facing for a significant period of time. Now, if we ever got to a time where we're going the opposite direction, then the legislature would have to look at whatever it needs to look at. But there's adequate funds from a revenue standpoint. The problem is what to do with respect to the rates, and then more broadly, I don't know if you've even gotten to the whole idea of the funding system vis-a-vis the Robin Hood system and reallocation, and that's another way if the state decides to continue to absorb more and more of those costs, they can control it a little bit more at a state level.
Well, why don't you break down for us the Robin Hood and recapture system, and just explain how it works, and explain your organization's take on that system.
So the important thing, a couple of points to remember, and they're both either in law or in state constitution. First of all, the Texas Constitution imposes the requirement upon the state to fund education. And so to fund the education of all children in the state of Texas, that is upon the state. Now, the state, by law, over the years, has decided to do that by authorizing local entities such as the school boards to levy and collect taxes at the local level. Over time, there has been a dislocation, if you will, based on property valuations in wealthy school districts versus non-wealthy school districts. And so as that split became greater and greater, the legislature was looking at it, but ultimately the courts weighed in because there were some lawsuits, and the Supreme Court of the state of Texas said that the state needed to do a better job of reallocating those funds to make sure that it was more evenly split between property-rich and property-poor school districts. That's how we ended up with the compromise that we have today that seemingly no one really likes, which is the reallocation system, which is often referred to as Robin Hood. And the state essentially imposes a requirement upon on reallocating some of the funds that are collected in property rich school districts, because they have a greater opportunity to collect revenue at a lower tax rate, and then a property poor school district where the valuations are lower has to raise their tax rate higher. So the state ends up reallocating some of those funds to make it more constitutionally even. Again, it's not a popular system, but again, if the state of Texas began to collect or impose some of those or absorb some of those costs on their own, that would take some of the pressure off of the locals from and the pressure from the reallocation system. The other important thing to remember constitutionally is the state does not have a statewide property tax. Constitutionally, the state of Texas cannot impose a statewide property tax. Otherwise, they could have simply just shifted that
nor an
burden.
income tax,
That's
right.
correct. So all the property taxes right now are levied and imposed by the locals, either cities, counties, school boards, or in some cases, special purpose districts. So the state of Texas has a say in how that is allocated, but doesn't actually collect the property tax itself.
Now, Rod, I'm going to ask all of you about this, but Rod, let me start with Rod. About slightly more than half of the property taxes we pay in Texas go toward the school maintenance and operation. Your organization would like to see that share, that tax eventually go to zero. How's that going to be possible?
So, and yes, we would. And I think, we've gone around the state and we even commissioned a survey a couple of years ago before the previous legislative session. And about 83% of property owners in the state of Texas believed that property taxes were too high and they were a burden on them and their families, which is certainly, in fact, I was in a committee hearing one time testifying, and the first question I had from the chair was, well, why would the 20% or so actually believe that property taxes were not excessive? So it's well understood that property taxes are a problem, and it is something that everyone's been looking at how to try to reduce those. If you looked at what I was talking about earlier about that disparity between the revenue growth to the state of Texas through its revenue collections, which are primarily sales tax, but there are some other taxes as well. That revenue growth continues at about a 9% increase pace. But certainly, great point earlier about, you can't necessarily predict that every year. But again, if you look on that as an average, the revenue growth has increased about 9%. The expenditures have been increasing about 5.5%. So the state budgets continue to grow, but the revenue grows even greater, which means we have a surplus every year on average. Not every year, but on average over that time period. If you commit a significant portion of that surplus toward buying down the property tax, then essentially what the legislature did this last session with the huge surplus, but also what it did the previous two sessions, which is apply some of the surplus that it had toward compressing the tax rate, then over time, you would be able to get that school M&O portion of the property tax, which is the lion's share of the property tax. If you did that, then at one point we had calculated it could take as much as 18, 20 years, which doesn't sound exciting to a lot of people, but it comes fast. But because we had a leg up this last session with this huge surplus, it could be done even faster. If the legislature committed to allocating that surplus toward buying down school M&O property taxes, you could get to a point where you eliminate that tax entirely.
Jay and John, what do you make of that?
It would be a dramatic change to how we do business. As a taxpayer, hey, sounds great. We need the revenue, though, to stay the same. We still need to fund our system. We believe, hey, wherever the tax money comes from, we need the tax money. We've got to fund public schools. We've got to fund it adequately, or I worry that the state will regret that decision. We've got to prepare young people to be able to fill the roles that are needed in our state. We've got to train and bring up these bright young people to be able to fulfill the need in society. The property tax issue is challenging. What we've seen in our district is values set by our local comptroller have been below what the state comptroller felt like they needed to be. So we've tried to bridge that gap, and I've heard complaints in my local district, and this is happening in a variety of places in the state where folks are frustrated because their property values are increasing dramatically. And, when we get the complaint, the bulk of the tax bill goes to the school district. At the same time, however, tax compression is not new. With this session, tax compression has happened. It's been happening. Homestead exemption increases have been happening. It was, I believe, 25,000, went up to 40,000. Now it's 100,000. So, I spoke with a group of citizens in my district, and I shared that, look, for me, my ISD tax bill has remained the same for the last 10 years. Although my value has increased dramatically, at the same time, compression has happened, homestead exemption has happened, so it's somewhat of a wash. Now, that may not be true for everyone. To the point, though, however you slice and dice the tax dollars, wherever it comes from, we need the revenue. We need to fund public education adequately, and we worry that we're reaching the point where we're not being funded adequately.
So I think on average, it is true. I think, as I was looking at this yesterday, I think on average, it's actually, if you look at the average, it's actually fallen slightly in the last 3 years. So I would support getting rid of the M&O tax. I think it's a bad tax. I think it's an inefficient tax. I think it requires the use of a Robin Hood system, which is a very inefficient way of achieving equality. I think the latest Supreme Court ruling, when the arguments were more on efficiency, the Supreme Court then came back and said, look, this is a Byzantine system. We're going to stay out of this. This is really for legislators. And so I think the table is set for the legislator to do something a little, do something big. And I think getting rid of the M&O tax, funding the system fully, and then allowing districts to use the local property tax as it should be used, which is to go to your voters and say, hey, we need a little extra money for our students. And you do that on top, and you have a constraint there imposed by the legislature. I think that would be good. In my school district, Spring Branch, they've just refused. The board did not allow the superintendent to send in their recapture payment. Now, they can't get away with that forever. The state has a lot of mechanisms to get that money, but it was just they're making a point, and they know they can't get away with it. But it's the point that, look, recaptures. I think we paid $83 million last year. Another example is HISD is a recapture district. Well, I can tell you right now, HISD they need every dollar they can get. Let's just put it that way.
How would that big reform? How would that big change come about, though? Where would the revenue come from?
Well, so he believes it can come through growth, and I think he's mostly right. I have proposed, back in 2006, myself and George Zodro, it's probably not going to be popular with everybody, but we proposed a business activity tax called a BAPT, a business activity and payroll tax, which would have been the payroll tax, which has been on government workers. But the idea we were shooting at is not really this certain thing, is we were just showing that for about half a percentage point, you could, and using growth and all the other sources we have, you could fund a really well-funded public education system and get rid of the M&O tax. We weren't married to that system. We weren't really proposing that system. We were just trying to show this can be done. We can reform the way Texas funds its public education system, and we can do it in a way where we don't just impose giant taxes. I do like the idea of slowly buying down the M&O tax over time. I think that's more efficient. I think it would be more equitable, and I agree that we can't continue not to give our teachers pay raises, and so if we need a very small additional tax somewhere to do that and bring education funding up to the level we need it to be efficient to fund our students, I would support that. I believe that education is the key issue facing not only Texas, but the U.S. If you look at almost all of the issues we face going forward, they would all be solved by a well-educated society. They're going to be made worse by a society that has two groups, one a well-educated group and one an uneducated group. That's only going to lead to bigger problems later on.
Yep.
I wanted to point out something else about getting away from the property taxes. You will have school districts that want to contribute, that want to invest more. And so any change, there needs to be a system, and I gleaned two different ideas from this. As it is right now, a local school district can tax at a higher rate for their yearly budget, for their maintenance and operation. And then we're probably all familiar with bond elections in which you can go to the voters and tax at a higher rate there. If we got away from the property tax system, there would just need to be something that gave local control to districts that wanted to invest more in their local ISD. And I think that's doable, whether if we went to an all sales tax, maybe a local district could have a little higher sales tax, or, impose a property tax on top of that. I'm far from, these guys are much more knowledgeable than me about ways to do that. But it would be important to maintain some sense of local control.
So Jay, a couple of questions though. I've been to school districts where the board and the superintendent have put bond measures on the ballot, in some cases to repair or rehabilitate schools that are decades old and really not in a state of good use. But the voters turn it down. Our population also is gradually aging in the U.S., as it is in most Western countries. Frankly, there are going to be more people who are voters who don't have kids in the public schools. So if you can't get the political support for those measures, what are the other options for school districts?
Yeah, it gets very tough because that yearly maintenance and operation budget is being, as I talked about earlier, 75% went to salaries. Now it's moving towards 85%, and there's just less resources there. What options do you have whenever you've got a dilapidated school and you can't get the support from your voters? Yeah, you get ready to spend a lot of money on maintenance, and you look at maybe consolidating campuses. You get streamlined. It's an efficiency matter. And at the same time, we've got accountability looking over our shoulder. Our district is somewhat in that situation. We failed a bond proposal in 2006 for a new high school. It failed. Followed quickly on its heels was Hurricane Harvey, which flooded a large portion of our school district. We benefited over time through FEMA dollars, which helped us rebuild 2 campuses. So we were able to eliminate that, but we had to use fund balance, excess funds, to help offset what FEMA didn't cover. But yeah, it's a problem, and you've got to communicate. Communication is such an important factor because anywhere from 60-70% of your population does not have a child in school, and all they see is their tax bill going up. So you've got to really help your community understand the investment they're making in the school district benefits everybody as a whole. But it's a difficult proposition.
I'll just throw in, what makes it really difficult in Texas is you're not just dealing with one type of school. You've got suburban schools, you've got urban schools, you've got rural schools. How can one financing system hit the numbers right for every school when there are such different organizations that are needed to educate students? I think that's a real problem with a one-size-fits-all financing system. And then I think the other thing is we're going to need technology to help us solve some of these problems.
Well, so John, can you elaborate on that? If I'm a school district in the Panhandle in a small town, we might be losing population. A place like Vider's stable, probably. A place like Plano, McKinney, Georgetown, Conroe, those places are exploding in population. How would a differentiated tax system work to address the needs of those different districts?
Well, a tax system that just funds students through, say, a sales tax only, you could come up with the right amount and then you distribute it. But the system we have, you could have a panhandle, small district that's sitting on top of oil-rich land, and they have more than enough money, but you can have an inner-city school district that's sitting on around dilapidated, empty buildings post-COVID, and all the values of those are falling, and they're not gonna have enough money. So how you solve it is a harder question. Stating there's a problem is really easy, and that's what I'm good at. It's the easy stuff. But it's just differences across. If you had a single funding system and the state funded the money, and then we gave local districts the options of raising some money within their district through some type of property tax, I think creating flexibility across districts, because each district is different. A district that has 70% foreign-speaking students or non-English speaking students versus a district that has 80% English-speaking students, two completely different school districts that are going to need different levels of funding.
Okay, this is the most, go ahead.
Well, I just want to point, going back to the property tax reduction, when you go to your voters now, that dollar amount is much less. So, all right, so for a bond election, previously, we would throw charts up and saying, look, this is how much it will cost you to pass a $100 million bond election. So, and you get negative feedback about that. But now that amount is much less because the property taxes have been reduced. That homestead exemption and then really makes a difference with regard to that. And that is important. Safety is a big factor. A lot of school districts are struggling with that. That is, when you get older buildings, how do you improve it? How do you improve it with the funds you have? It's really hard. But you can use that as something with the property tax reduction that does help whenever you're trying to sell something to the voters. That dollar amount that's going to come out of folks' pocket is going to be less now.
So this is the most provocative question. Is a state income tax the third rail of Texas politics? Only about a half dozen states still don't have one. I believe Florida and Texas are the largest. Could you ever see a time when the demands on Texas government are great enough that there needs to be a state income tax? And could that tax get political support if it were, say, devoted to health and education?
No, and no. I'll just,
Ditto.
driving your population out of the state by having really high income taxes, we've seen that's a bad idea. Anything you can do with an income tax, you can do with the consumption tax, and it's more efficient. So I wouldn't support an income tax. I just support raising the right amount with a really efficient consumption tax so that we continue to grow, we continue to bring businesses. All of that helps you fund schools. Once you cut off economic growth, then you're only left with two options: raising taxes or cutting spending. You really don't want to have those, so.
Yeah, I mean, I echo that entirely. I will say, if you look at the larger states in the country, the ones that have an income tax are lagging in economic growth, and then the ones that do not have an income tax are exceeding that. So you've got Texas, Florida, Tennessee, states like that are doing better than the Californias, New Yorks, and Illinois. In fact, some of those states with income taxes are actually, at this point, because of a number of factors, it's not just their income tax, they just have bad fiscal policy and regulatory policy as well. But they're driving out business and they're driving out capital, and as a result, their gross state product is actually shrinking. So their economies are shrinking while Texas and Florida and Tennessee's are expanding. And if we continue at this current projection, Texas will actually surpass the economic output of the state of California, and possibly their population is sometime in the next 15 or 20 years. So not that I want to see even more people move into the state of Texas, but we certainly don't want to drive out individuals and businesses. We do, remember, have a constitutional requirement that the state of Texas cannot impose an income tax, and that's fairly new as of about 3 years ago when the voters put that into the state constitution. There's also a constitutional provision on this ballot, besides the property tax homestead exemption, that would also prohibit a wealth tax. So Texas does not have a wealth tax. I don't know that we ever even proposed that, but a number of states have been proposing wealth taxes that are beyond any kind of an income tax.
Just,
and we're
just to
not
be
gonna
clear,
do that.
this
So
would be a
everyone-
tax on unrealized capital gains.
That's correct.
So very controversial.
Very controversial.
Yeah.
Bad idea. Again, you're going to drive away capital. Capital flight is a real thing, especially these days when so much of it can move electronically. Push of a button, you can move capital from one state or jurisdiction to another. If you impose taxes on that capital, whatever it may be, it will move to another state. It will move to another jurisdiction. You do not want to do that. And it would be a bad idea. So that would be one of the constitutional restrictions as well.
So I got to get in one question about renters. About a third of our state's households are renters. Obviously, we know there are many Texas families and many Americans who live paycheck to paycheck and don't have a lot of cash savings, even if there were an emergency. The renters did not get benefit from direct relief from this tax compromise that's going to be voted on in November. And yet 17 states do have ways of giving direct property tax relief to renters. Why isn't that part of this package?
Technically, it's not true that it's not part. So the 10.7 cents in compression does benefit renters to some extent. It's the increase in the homestead exemption that didn't hit renters at all.
For the 10
So
points,
there's a small benefit to renters. It could have been larger had
Okay.
we done all compression.
Yeah, and to that point, and the local jurisdictions even know this because there are sort of I wouldn't even say it's a new phenomenon, but it's growing. A lot of local jurisdictions, counties particularly, are creating or contracting with foundations that are providing low-income housing. And when they do that, they provide a property tax exemption or reduction on that property. Well, if they're doing that with the idea that lowering property taxes will in fact help alleviate some of the increases in rental rates. So there's a recognition that property taxes do have a role in rent, and if you reduce the property taxes substantially, like we're planning to do, and that will come to fruition this year, then that should result in a reduction, or at least it will provide some relief to the landlord so that they can reduce those rates. Now, there's more to it, obviously, than just reducing the rates because there's so much demand for rent. So they may not come down as much as the tax benefit would be there, but nonetheless, they should come down. And I do agree that the property tax compression is a benefit to renters indirectly.
Jay?
Well, yeah, I would say probably a little higher percentage of renters in our district. And so, yeah, hopefully they will see that their rent does not go up as quickly, and we'll see that benefit there, just speaking on our community.
Now, a final question. Texas has been blessed with great economic growth, a really record surplus, but times could change. Inflation is high. The Fed seems to be at least slowing down the rate of increases. But interest rates are high. You know, it's tightening monetary conditions and borrowing, and then of course there's a chance of cyclical, things. Texas historically, because of its reliance on energy, has had boom and bust cycles. So, how worried should we be, or concerned should we be that we could have a bust, which would change the fiscal position entirely, especially with some of the changes going on in the energy industry?
So so the things I worry about, so high interest rates, I think one of the concerns I have in the housing market is there's a very high propensity for homeowners to be locked in at this point. I have a 3% interest rate. I can look at houses all day long. I'm never going to move. I mean, it would double my mortgage payment to move from where I am now to another house. And so the supply of housing has shrunk. The supply of sellable housing or housing on the market for sale is really small. So that's going to prop up home prices. The Fed's goal of trying to reduce home prices doesn't seem to be working. And so that's a problem as we move forward. We started the year and we were definitely going to have a recession, and then we didn't, and now we're absolutely not going to have a recession. All of the past 7 recessions happened right after everybody said, we're definitely not going to have a recession. So now I'm really scared that we're going to have a recession earlier in the year.
What's the
I felt-
saying that economists have predicted 9 out of the last 3 recessions?
Yes. So I think that we are set up for a slowdown. The consumer, you can see if you look at excess savings, we went through a period where consumers were saving a lot more than they needed to. Consumers are taking on more debt. Savings is well below the average level of savings in the past 20 years. And so I think the slowing consumer is going to bring the economy down, whether that turns into a deep recession, a very shallow recession or not. It's yet to be determined.
Yeah, there's always a chance. I mean, I don't like to live in fear, but certainly you can look historically. We will have downturns. We'll have downturns again. That's why I said before, with respect to our plan for the state absorbing more and more of the cost of education, you still have to plan for potential downturns. You can't just prognosticate that we will always be in boom time. But again, you project on a long-term basis, and if you do that on a long-term basis, Texas has a lot more potential, I think, than most states for continued economic growth because of the constraints on the legislature and on local districts for raising their expenditures, and the fact that we have a tax and regulatory environment that I think surpasses most states. I think we're always going to be one of the leaders, and frankly, we've been the leader in economic growth and job growth. I think, 4 or 5 straight years. I think it's a sort of a record. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they track all these quarterly, over multiple years now, we've been leading the nation, and that's true even if we go into an economic downturn. I think we'll be in a better position to sustain ourselves in that downturn and then bounce back faster than some of these other states.
So while Jay answers that question, I'd like you all to assemble in front of the microphones to ask questions, please. Jay.
They might have to assemble quickly because I've got a Rice University professor in public policy talking taxes, and I'm a 6th grade English teacher before I started my administrative route. I will say this: we're funded off of student enrollment. So whenever I hear, okay, there could be a downturn in the number of homes being bought in our district, maybe it shifts more towards a renter. Maybe that percentage of renters goes up. Those are, the economic issues are always at play with us as far as the number of people moving to our area. And we're a coastal school district. We knew all too well 5 or 6 years ago. We got hit 2 years in a row, and it dropped our student enrollment, and it dropped our population. So, all those factors play together. We need people. We need students, and we need to put forth, here's my pitch again about funding public education is we need to put our best foot forward. We need to provide the most we can for our students, and that begins with salaries for our teachers and helping just build that infrastructure with people. We're in the people business.
We're going to just start over here first so we can also encourage people to ask their questions online at texastribune.org/ask. texastribune.org/ask. There's a question here from Naomi in Austin. Is there a requirement that landlords pass along property tax savings to renters? If not, then is the benefit to renters from compression merely speculative? Before we go to responses here, we are going to go over 5 minutes or so to make sure we get everyone's questions.
I was going to ask John that earlier, so I'm glad our friend in Austin asked.
Yeah, there's no requirement that they pass it on, but the market is driven by demand and supply. And so if you change demand and supply, the amount of the reduction in property taxes will be split depending on the elasticities of demand and supply in that market. In the rental market, we see that demand and supply is relatively elastic, I guess not really elastic or inelastic, and so I would expect it's going to be split about 50-50 between renters and landlords. Now, that may show up as a smaller increase in rental prices and not as a decrease, but that's because we're in a period where inflation's going up, last year 10%, this year it's going to be 4%. So to expect a decrease in rents would be unrealistic expectation.
Yes, Sid Roberts. I'm on the Angelina College board here, and we don't have oil wells on our property like Midland College, for example, does. What are the implications, if any, or expectations, if any, of the proposed property tax relief for local education funding taxing authorities, like a college district, like a city, county, if the property tax proposal passes? How does that change local taxing authority recommendations?
I would say get an oil well. I don't think, so for special, is that a special purpose district? I don't think it changed that. I think you're still free to, I think you have more leeway in setting your rate than other districts, but I'm not 100% clear on that.
Well, and that also goes for cities, counties, all the potential funders for the education systems. Is it just an even, it comes out even in the end and nobody changes what their tax rates are? Or are there expectations?
Again, the focus at this point has not been on the taxing authority of the special purpose district. So whatever that, whatever your needs are, that you've been able to collect enough taxes or not, essentially that dynamic stays the same. I don't think there's been any change that would be impacting that one way or the other.
Oh, go ahead. No.
Yeah, I think what he said is right. There's a truth in taxation form and a worksheet, and nothing on that worksheet has changed. And so all those calculations will stay the same. It'll just start from a different place.
Thank you. I have a question. I'm Robin Carroll from Dallas. So are charter schools impacting enrollment in the public schools, reducing the number of students enrolled, and thereby impacting funding for public schools?
Yes, they are. Not in our district. So I would say in the more metropolitan areas, it is a concern. I hear that in our organizations that, enrollment is declining. Then you get into the bigger issue of they are state funded, so that pulls state funds away from local school districts. The interesting thing is it's a more competitive environment for public schools than it's ever been. And that could potentially become even more competitive with education savings accounts or vouchers being proposed right now. So, there is increased anxiety among public schools. We do feel like we can provide the best education possible. We understand the competition, we recognize it, and we're ready. We just feel the concern I hear constantly is we need to be provided the resources to compete on that level. And you even factor in accountability also. Charter schools are subject to accountability, but private schools, if they start receiving public tax dollars, are not subject to that accountability. So to answer your question, yes, it does make a difference. Yeah.
I will also note that our next public event will be on October 18th in Austin on school choice and the special session.
There is a related question. If a cost of living, this is from TJ in Nacogdoches. If a cost of living adjustment increase for teacher retirement is a prop we have to vote on, why are school vouchers not a prop the voters will have to vote on?
I don't know that I know the legislative process well enough to answer that question. That probably would have been something for the previous panel. But it may get there, and I think that's been thrown out by the governor that it could end up being voted on if we can't come to some kind of resolution through the special session. So, I'm just going to leave it there. I'm not knowledgeable. I don't have the knowledge base to answer that completely.
Yeah, the short answer, of course, is the legislature would have to pass any proposed constitutional amendment first before it goes to the voters, and that did not pass. That's why the governor is calling the legislature back in on that very topic in this upcoming special session.
Great. Rod Bordelon, Jake Hilgo, John Diamond, thank you all so much for sharing your insights.